Hey guys, it's Tim here. We've talked about consistency in racing lines, the rules and etiquette of the track. So next, we're going to talk about setting up your cars. We're going to start with the most basic and probably the most important adjustment on the car, and that's ride height. We usually set it and forget it and stop thinking about it, but it's always changing, and we should always be playing with it to get more handling characteristics that are desirable for our track as conditions change. So it's really another knob that we can turn to get the most out of our car. Why ride height is so important is it impacts the center of gravity of the car. And if you can lower your ride height, your car will stay flatter in the turns, and it'll feel really planted. It'll feel really predictable. And that's how you get that feeling where you can put the car exactly where you want it. It's when it's planted and stable. It gives that real feeling of confidence because the car isn't rolling so much and you're not getting so much weight transfer, changing the grip on you halfway through the corner. Higher ride height, your car will be a little bit more reactive as you'll increase your center of gravity and you're going to get more weight transfer in the corners, which can be really helpful in a low grip or very technical layout, getting that quick weight transfer to the front tires and getting through technical parts of the track a little bit more agilely. But in the high speed, it'll feel unstable. Sweepers, it'll be a little bit more difficult to drive. So you're always finding that balance between stability and responsiveness. Another thing you got to worry about is bottoming out. Your car can't be so low that it hits the track surface. Where I race in 5280 in Denver, or Lakewood, Colorado, we have a couple different batches of RCP tiles that make up our RCP collection. And it seems like no matter what we do, we'll drag weights and stuff across the track surface, try to get it as flat and smooth as possible. But there's always a couple bumps from the different thickness of tiles. And we can't really get around that. So you got to have enough ride height to clear the couple bumps in the track. So on a really smooth track, you can get nice and low, down to like 1.5, 1.7. In Colorado, 1.8, 1.9. Otherwise, you can bottom out. Too high, and you'll be tippy, traction rolly, difficult to drive, unpredictable, kind of a wild feeling car. And another thing is air will go under the car instead of over it, and the aero from your body won't work. You'll have too much air going under the car instead of over your nice aero here. So another thing about having a car too high is you'll lose overall grip eventually. Another thing that we can play with is ride height balance between the front and rear. If your front is lower than the rear, you'll get a more reactive car, a little bit better turn in, and it'll feel a little bit more agile, a little more nimble. If your front is higher than the rear, it's going to feel more stable, more consistent. Something I like to do at the big races where grip really comes up towards the end of the event and we all start traction rolling and the cars get edgy, hard to drive, is I'll go from like 1.8 up front to 2 just to take the edge off the grip coming up. So you can really change the handling characteristics of the car by lowering or raising just the front and rear. You don't have to keep all 4 corners the same. So how do we adjust ride height? This is a Reflex SE. We control the rear ride height with these 2 shims here. We control the middle ride height with this collar on the rear dampener. and front ride height with these two collars on the A-arms. So you're going to need a ride height gauge. I highly recommend you have a ride height gauge. I don't know how anyone can race without one of these. You have to set up the most important adjustment of your car accurately. So get a gauge. They're pretty cheap, easy to find. I like the gradual ones. There are some with notches in them. I don't really like those, just a personal preference. They all work. Get a ride height gauge, probably one of the most important tools. It should always be easily accessible. Get a ride height gauge. All right. I always start with the rear at the axle on this car. Press it down a couple times, get all the droop out, make sure we're just measuring the ride height here. And let's see, about 2.1, just a little high, 2.1. It should be the same. Otherwise, you've got to tweak as long as you have the same shims on each side. So I'm not surprised that they're the same. I start back here, and then I work the ride height closer to the middle of the car. I always measure at this plate. Get that centered up. Get all the droop out. Here we go. And about 2 millimeters. Check this side just to be sure. 2 mils. Whenever I'm doing a new setup, my default measurement is always 2 millimeters of ride height. I will change it from there if I need to, but I always start at 2. I know a couple manufacturers have different starting points. Always reference your owner's manual, user guide, whatever you have for the car you have. I think for Reflex it's always 2, so that's where I like to start. Next we'll go up to the front, right there, right behind a front wheel, and that is also at 2 millimeters. Check this side, make sure we're symmetrical. Right at 2. So that's how you measure your ride height. If you need to raise it, you just increase your spring preload by tightening that collar. Now we're all the way up to 2.5. If you need to raise it, you increase preload, tighten the collar. Now we're all the way up to almost 3. So that's how you adjust it. That's how you measure it with a handy dandy ride height gauge. This is just going to be useful for the cars with A-arms and collars. I don't actually own a Kingpin car anymore, so let's go up to my computer and I'll show you guys how a Kingpin front suspension works. All right, see you in a minute. Alrighty, let's look at a car with a Kingpin style front suspension. This is the Reflex KISS front end. It's a Kingpin, and all that means is the knuckle here rides on a pin, or the Kingpin, that goes through the bottom arm up into the top arm, and you can see the springs sitting there. There's no collars to increase or decrease preload. The easiest way to adjust ride height on Kingpin suspensions is shims. So these are shims. They fit right under or right above the 3 screws that hold this down onto the chassis, and you can add shims under this bulkhead to lower the ride height, and you can take the shims out to raise the ride height. So the easiest way is to shim the whole bulkhead up and down, and that will change your ride height without worrying about anything else. You can also adjust ride height by increasing what this diagram calls spacer D, or spacer C, this guy here. You can add a shim here, and that will add preload to the spring, raising your ride height. Spacer D If you increase it, it will not increase your ride height. It'll take away droop. And we'll talk about droop later in a later video. Don't worry about it for now. Spacer D is just controlling droop in a kingpin style suspension. Another popular example of the kingpin style front suspension right now is the MWXR1. The shim there, that's a spacer D, that's a droop shim. And these are ride height shims, spacers C. They're above the knuckle, and they increase the preload on the spring, increasing ride height. I'm not an expert in the MWXs, but these shims will be what control the preload on the spring and therefore the ride height. And I'm not sure if you can, the way this car is set up, shim the entire thing up to adjust your ride height. So this might be an example of a car where your shim stack is what controls the ride height, like in this diagram here, spacer C and spacer D. That is the kingpin style front end. Next, we'll talk about cars that set the rear ride height with a rear axle insert. Alright, here's a cutout or a photo of a car that uses eccentrics on the rear axle to change the ride height. This black piece here, the hole can be moved up or down. So you will buy different inserts, or the car will come with different inserts for the motor mount here. And this hole will be moved up and down in each of the different eccentrics. That's what these guys are called, eccentrics. And you'll put a bearing in, and you'll put an axle through it. And depending on if this hole is up or down, will change your rear ride height. On my SE, there's just shims down here, and this is always in a fixed location. On a car with eccentrics, there's no shims down here. The motor mount stays in a fixed location, but you move the axle up and down in the carrier. If the hole is down low, it'll raise your ride height. If the hole is up high in the eccentric, it'll lower your ride height. And that is how you adjust the ride height in a car with rear axle eccentrics instead of shims. Alright guys, that is all the different ways I can think of to adjust your ride height, and we covered all the reasons you want to adjust your ride height. I would just for now make sure all of your ride heights are somewhere between like 2.2 and 1.8 millimeters in all four corners. And after they are all the same, all leveled up, go practice, go run some laps, see how the car feels, and start changing it. Start playing with it, start seeing what you like, and always reference the owner material that you get with your car, see what the recommended starting points are, build it to kit, try it the kit way first, and then you can start making adjustments with all the methods we talked about today. Alright guys, have a good rest of your week, and we'll see you next Friday.